The Cold War, baby. What's up? You know, it was so refreshing when I saw that new Star Wars movie and they finally got it right. It wasn't about spaceships. It was about communists. Now get your mind out of the gutter. This is not a sexy time period in history. This is where we're gonna learn about communism and capitalism, democracy and authoritarianism, freedom and oppression. And by the end of this, you should be able to explain what the heck was happening during the Cold War. But if you're still thinking about spaceships, well, don't worry, because space will come into it later. Okay, so what started all of this? Well, let me introduce you to two really important guys. Winston Churchill, leader of Great Britain during World War II, and Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union during World War II. Here they are. They look very different, but they have one thing in common. They both hate each other's guts. Churchill has long believed that communists were evil and he didn't trust Stalin at all. Remember, these guys fought on the same side in World War II, but they can't stand each other. After the war ended, both of them did exactly what they threatened to do throughout the entire war. Like break up Germany and occupy it with their own soldiers. It was only a matter of time before they got into a fight. Oh, and just to let you know, that fight is gonna be kind of important. So Churchill decided to set up shop in Western Germany with France and Belgium and Italy. And Stalin decided to set up shop in Eastern Germany with Poland and Romania and Hungary. See? The problem here is that those lines are not straight. Most of Europe is in this grey area in between. So now there's lots of countries over here and over here who are trying to decide which side they want to be on, in an effort to keep those countries safe from the communists. The United States and Canada join forces with many European nations to form an alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. A few weeks later, Stalin gets pissed off and starts his own alliance with the countries he occupies. We call this the Warsaw Pact. And for the next 40 years, we be watching these two alliances go head to head like it's the frickin' UFC. But before we get to the good stuff, we need to talk about this tiny country right here called West Germany. After World War II, they wanted to turn this country into a communist country, but West Germany was very anti-communist, so the people protested and got rid of their communist leaders. And then they elected someone who promised to rebuild the economy. His name was Ludwig Erhard, and he was doing such a good job that West Germany went from looking like this to looking like this in less than 20 years. I guess you could say they rebuilt better than they had before. Now, this was bad news for the Soviet Union, because if West Germany kept growing economically, well, then its influence over Europe might grow as well. So Stalin decided that he needed to take action. Let me show you a map. All the countries in red were part of the Soviet Union, and all the countries in pink were part of the German sphere of influence. What Stalin decided to do was block off West Berlin, which was deep within East Germany. And then he said to the people of West Berlin, hey, if you want us to stop bombing the crap out of your city, then you gotta switch to communism. However, the people of West Berlin were like, no thanks, we'd rather starve to death. So they refused to accept any food, coal, or medicine from East Germany. Luckily, the Americans brought a shitload of supplies over there and dropped it off. They even flew food and supplies in planes and dropped it from the sky like a giant game of Sky P. The Soviet Union tried everything they could to stop them, including cutting off their power, but it didn't work. The Berlin airlift lasted almost a year, and it was a decisive American victory. The point is that the people of West Berlin refused to become communist despite being completely cut off from resources. And that demonstrated that communism was not a good option. especially when compared to democratic capitalism. The US was getting cocky after that little victory, so they decided to flex again. This time, it was in Cuba. For years, the US had been supporting a dictator in Cuba, who kept putting down rebellions against him. But in 1959, a major revolution broke out led by Fidel Castro. Castro eventually took over the country and turned it into a communist country. The Americans weren't too happy about this, so they tried to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro, but it was a total failure. And now the Americans were in a panic because the Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which meant that they could bomb the entire United States. There was literally nothing the US could do about it. So they negotiated with the Soviets and made a deal. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba if the Americans removed their missiles from Turkey. In addition, the Americans agreed to never invade Cuba again, which they probably shouldn't have done in the first place. This is called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. In fact, we got so close that John F. Kennedy's brother wrote down a speech that he would give to the American people announcing that we were going to war with the Soviet Union. Thank goodness it was never needed. All right, now we can talk about space, because, as you may have heard, the Americans landed astronauts on the moon in 1969. That was huge. It was like the ultimate flexing. If you can't beat M, join M. This is called the space race. Even though we can't kill each other with nuclear weapons, we can try to kill each other's astronauts. Luckily, that never happened. But more importantly, neither side ever launched a direct attack against the other. Instead, they fought in what we call proxy wars. First up is the Korean War. As soon as the fighting stopped in Korea, the North and the South each claimed that they were the real Korea and began fighting each other. The Soviet Union supported the North and China supported the South. At least I'm pretty sure that was the other way around. Anyway, America came to the rescue and sent troops to help out. This war was nasty and it ended in a stalemate. Next up is the Vietnam War. Back in the early 1900s, European powers were setting up colonies in Southeast Asia, and since they couldn't agree on who gets what, they drew a line through the middle of the most populated region and divided it into two separate countries. Fast forward to 1955, when the two countries begin fighting over who controls this land. Again, the Americans support the South, and the Soviet Union supports the North. When the Americans entered the war, it was devastating. However, they struggled to fight against the Vietnamese, and after 4 years of fighting, they pulled out, and the North won. Sad, sad, sad. Then we have the Afghan War. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan because they wanted to turn it into another communist country. However, the mountains were no joke, and the locals hated their guts. Plus, the Americans provided a ton of military support to the locals, and it wasn't going well. So the Soviet Union pulled out, and the locals won. Yay, so those are our 3 big proxy wars, and honestly, they were terrible. But something else that came out of those wars was some truly terrifying inventions like napalm, Agent Orange, and the AK-47. And one more thing about the Cold War. Both sides were developing nuclear weapons, which gave them the ability to destroy the entire planet. And this competition is called the nuclear arms race. By 1989, the Soviet Union had 44,000 nuclear warheads, and the US had 33,000 nuclear warheads. I don't think you can appreciate how insane that number is today. Anyway, by the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was in sharp decline, and remember earlier when I told you that West Germany went from this to this in 20 years? Well, turns out that the rest of Europe was doing the same thing. And if you're wondering why, it's because they had free markets, and the Soviet Union was trying to run their economy with communism. Surprise, surprise, one system worked and the other didn't. By 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. This was a symbolic win for the Americans, and it showed that communism was clearly on its last legs. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and communism fell in Eastern Europe. Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union at this time, and he is responsible for ending the Cold War. He introduced reforms to try to save the failing Soviet Union, but it was too little too late. And that, my friends, is what happened during the Cold War. Okay, that's what happened. Now let's find out what you remember. You know, I should mention that Canada played a huge role in peacekeeping efforts during the Cold War. We sent troops to places like Korea and Cyprus, and the Congo. I mean, not to brag or anything, but Canada is pretty cool. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already.